What exactly were Boeing's so-called shadow factories? Think of it this way. Sometimes people face a tough problem and choose a quick, messy, and costly fix just to keep things moving. What's meant to be temporary often drags on far longer than expected and, sometimes, becomes permanent. That's essentially what happened to Boeing, but on a massive industrial scale. Now, to be precise, these weren't true factories in the traditional sense, but the nickname shadow factories stuck for good reason. They represent a difficult period in Boeing's recent history. Thankfully, most of that chapter is now behind the company, which is working hard to restore its reputation in global aviation. So, what actually happened? On Tuesday, August 12, 2025, a Boeing 737 MAX 8 lifted off from Grant County International Airport in Moses Lake, Washington. The jet carried no passengers, understandable, since it was still technically Boeing's property, but it wasn't a corporate aircraft either. Almost immediately after leaving the factory, it was flown to Moses Lake, where it sat for nearly 6 years. But on that August day in 2025, it finally departed, bound for Victorville, California. There it would be repainted, re-registered as B20DJ, and if all went smoothly, delivered to Air China before the year's end. That is, of course, assuming politics didn't interfere. Why was this flight so meaningful? To understand, you need to know what Moses Lake means to Boeing. The site's history stretches back to 1942, when it opened as Moses Lake Army Air Base. Named after a nearby town in Lake, it quickly became a vital training field for U.S. Army Air Force pilots during World War II. In 1943, even Boeing B-17 crews trained there. After the war, Boeing maintained its presence. The first B-47 Stratojet landed there after its maiden flight. And by 1953, Boeing had constructed hangars and facilities to support testing of the then-new B-52 bomber. Over the years, the base hosted trials for the KC-135 and other models. When the Air Force vacated the site in 1966, Moses Lake transitioned into a civilian airport. Boeing, however, stayed put. For decades, the company used the site to train pilots. In fact, many Japan Airlines 747 captains learned to handle the Queen of the Skies right there. But aside from training, many of Boeing's older hangars became little more than storage units housing outdated tools and unused equipment. That situation persisted until 2019, the year the aviation world changed. In March of that year, following 2 deadly crashes, the 737 MAX fleet was grounded worldwide. One of the aircraft caught in the aftermath was the very MAX we've been talking about. It sat at Moses Lake, just one of many jets Boeing had no way to deliver. Here's why the August 2025 flight mattered. It marked the last of those long-stored certified 737 MAX jets finally leaving Moses Lake. In other words, Boeing had finally cleared its backlog of undelivered aircraft that had piled up during the crisis years. But this story isn't just about MAX aircraft sitting in storage. While the official grounding lasted from early 2019 to late 2020, planes kept filling shadow sites for years after. By mid-2023, Boeing still had dozens of jets gathering dust, and it was only the 737. The 787 Dreamliner also had its own storage facilities acting as shadow factories until quite recently. This brings us to production. Right now, Boeing is capped at producing no more than 38 MAX jets per month, a restriction imposed by the FAA in 2024 after the infamous door plug blowout scandal. So, while the MAX crisis sparked the creation of these shadow factories, other setbacks and delays extended their use for years longer than anyone expected. Today, with that last Moses Lake MAX finally flying out, Boeing can finally close the book on this shadowy era of its history. Before the 737 MAX crisis erupted in 2019, Boeing's production line was running at full speed. The company was rolling out 52 aircraft per month and had ambitions to climb to nearly 60. When the worldwide grounding hit, you might expect those production plans to have collapsed immediately. Surprisingly, they didn't, at least not for many months. Let's look at why. Even after the ban, Boeing continued building the 737 MAX at a rate of around 42 aircraft per month during most of 2019. That number is still higher than the 38 jets they are limited to producing today. But why keep building airplanes nobody was allowed to fly? The answer lies in how aircraft manufacturers get paid. Airlines and leasing companies usually put down small deposits when they place their orders, but the bulk of the payment only comes when the aircraft is delivered. With the MAX grounded, Boeing could not hand over any airplanes, which meant no final payments. The company suddenly faced a painful choice. Option 1 was to halt production entirely. That would have reduced some of the massive financial losses, but it would have triggered devastating consequences. Workers would have to be laid off or furloughed, which could cripple Boeing's workforce. Skilled mechanics and engineers require continuous certification to keep working. And if those certifications lapse during downtime, restarting production becomes incredibly difficult. Suppliers would face the same issue: factories shutting down, staff laid off, and supply chains collapsing. And in 2019, the US was in an economic upswing, which meant that skilled labor was already in short supply. Once gone, many workers might never come back. Option 2 was to keep producing at a reduced but steady pace enough to keep Boeing's 3 assembly lines in Renton alive and to keep suppliers afloat. That's the option Boeing chose. They settled on about 42 jets per month, even though they couldn't deliver them and therefore couldn't collect payment. This decision meant the company was losing staggering amounts of money every single day. But the financial losses weren't the only problem. Building aircraft without delivering them quickly created a new crisis: storage. Where would Boeing park all of these brand new planes? At first, the company used every available space at Renton, even filling empty bays and makeshift parking areas. But with 42 new aircraft rolling out each month, Renton filled up almost instantly. The overflow went to Boeing Field in Seattle, just a few miles away, where even car parks were converted into temporary storage zones. And yes, these airplanes were flown to their storage locations. Even though the MAX was grounded worldwide, Boeing was allowed to perform relocation flights under strict conditions and with special checks. The strategy behind continuing production was simple. When the grounding finally lifted, Boeing wanted to have hundreds of finished jets ready for immediate delivery. Airlines and leasing firms had planned their fleet expansions years in advance and were counting on those planes. At the time, Boeing's order book for the MAX stood at roughly 4,500 aircraft. Today, that backlog has grown even larger, sitting close to 4,850 jets. This production gamble kept Boeing's supply chain alive, but at the cost of enormous financial losses and the creation of the so-called shadow factories, where rows of undelivered aircraft sat waiting for clearance to fly passengers again. By keeping production running at near normal levels, Boeing was betting on a fast rebound. The idea was simple. Once regulators cleared the 737 MAX to fly again, Boeing could immediately hand over hundreds of finished jets to customers. Those deliveries would generate a massive wave of cash, wiping out much of the money lost during the grounding. At least, that was the theory. In practice, the plan had some serious cracks. Airlines receiving dozens of jets all at once still expected compensation for delays. More concerning was the erosion of trust. Several carriers outright canceled orders in the wake of the crashes, reflecting the public's shaken confidence in the aircraft. But the biggest flaw was timing. Boeing had assumed the grounding would last only weeks. Executives publicly hinted that the plane would be back in the skies before the end of 2019. Internally, Boeing even expected the pause to last just a few months. To bridge the gap, the company began ferrying undelivered 737s to Moses Lake in the spring of 2019. The move was supposed to be temporary, 6 months, at most. Instead, it turned into a 6-year ordeal. Parking jets was only part of the challenge. Airplanes can't just sit indefinitely without attention. Like cars, their upkeep is tied not only to how often they're used, but also to time itself. Maintenance schedules factor in hours flown, takeoff and landing cycles, and calendar intervals. Even if a jet isn't moving, certain parts, fluids, and systems need regular servicing. That's where Moses Lake's old hangars, once used for B-52 testing, suddenly found new purpose. Technicians had to cover cabin windows to shield interiors from ultraviolet damage, circulate protective fluids through hydraulic and fuel systems, and keep electronics powered up and updated. Engines needed periodic runs, and whenever a plane had to be repositioned, the storage prep had to be reversed, so it was flight-ready. Managing this required an army of workers. At its peak, Moses Lake held around 250 grounded 737s. To keep them in shape, Boeing employed nearly 1,000 people on site. The operation was so extensive that Boeing insiders nicknamed it a shadow factory, a tongue-in-cheek label that was in far from the truth. The site had the feel of a massive maintenance hub, with the manpower and equipment of a production line, but no new planes being built. And Moses Lake wasn't alone. Similar facilities emerged in San Antonio, Texas, and Victorville, California. Still, Moses Lake stood out as the first to ramp up and the last to wind down. But the cost of sustaining these shadow factories was staggering. As months slipped by, Boeing kept reassuring the public that the MAX would return before the end of 2019. That optimistic messaging strained relations with the FAA, which was already bruised by criticism of its close relationship with Boeing. Traditionally, other regulators around the world deferred to the FAA's judgment. But after the MAX disasters, that trust was shattered. Aviation authorities in Europe, China, and elsewhere began conducting their own reviews, putting even more pressure on the FAA not to rush. By late 2019, reality could no longer be ignored. The MAX wouldn't fly again anytime soon. In December of that year, Boeing's board dismissed CEO Dennis Muilenburg and made the painful choice to shut down MAX production entirely. The outcome was brutal. Boeing had spent 10 months pouring money into building jets it couldn't deliver, then absorbed all the disruption that came with halting assembly lines. In the end, they suffered the worst of both strategies. The decision to halt MAX production in late 2019 didn't just slow Boeing down. It meant that when regulators eventually cleared the aircraft, ramping back up would be painfully difficult. Before that could even happen, hundreds of parked jets needed significant updates. Mechanics and engineers had to apply both software and hardware modifications required by the FAA before the planes could carry passengers again. But there was yet another complication. Because of strained relations between Boeing and the FAA, regulators insisted on personally signing off on each aircraft before delivery. In the past, Boeing employees had handled many of these approvals under FAA oversight, which kept the process efficient. Now, with the FAA taking a far more hands-on approach, the pace of deliveries dragged on not for months, but for years. The delay stretched well past the end of the MAX grounding and into the period when global travel was beginning to recover after the pandemic. The shadow factory story wasn't just about the 737. Boeing had another one centered on the 787 Dreamliner when production of the 787 shifted to North Charleston, South Carolina. The company repurposed space at its Everett plant for inspecting and reworking Dreamliners that had already been assembled. This stemmed from manufacturing issues with how fuselage sections were joined. Fixing those problems was so labor-intensive that it often took longer to disassemble and repair the planes than it would have to build them from scratch. That facility ran for nearly 5 years before finally closing in early 2025. Shutting down these sites was a major milestone. Even if Boeing didn't immediately need the hangars for new projects, the shadow factories tied up hundreds of skilled workers who could have been assigned to more productive roles. Many of those employees are now being reassigned. 787 technicians are moving into other programs, and maintenance teams from Moses Lake are heading back to Renton to work on new 737s. Yet, relocating people isn't without challenges. Some employees had built lives in Moses Lake during the years of storage work, buying homes and settling their families there, and not all were eager to move. Meanwhile, Boeing's challenges are far from over. Although the company has cleared its backlog of stored MAX-8 and MAX-9 jets, it still faces delays with the smallest and largest members of the family, the MAX-7 and MAX-10. Certification for these variants has been pushed back largely due to design changes for the engine anti-ice system and may not be completed until 2026. As of now, Boeing has about 35 of these jets waiting in storage, and that number could rise before certification arrives. The 777-9 program faces similar hurdles. Several aircraft are already complete or partially complete at Everett, but Boeing is still working toward certification, which they hope to secure before the end of 2025. Until then, more jets will remain grounded in storage, requiring constant upkeep. All of this means Boeing will continue needing teams to maintain undelivered airplanes for years to come, even as it prepares to ramp up production again. Plans are already underway for a new 737 MAX assembly line in Everett, pending FAA approval. Still, the symbolic importance of that final stored 737 MAX, leaving Moses Lake, cannot be overstated. For Boeing, it marked the end of one of the most difficult chapters in its history, a step toward moving on. There's also a geopolitical dimension. The last 20 MAX aircraft stored at Moses Lake were all destined for Chinese Airlines. Tensions between Washington and Beijing have already complicated some aircraft deliveries, and future trade disputes could further impact Boeing's ability to sell jets in one of its most important markets. For now, though closing the shadow factories represents progress, Boeing still has a long road ahead, but the departure of the last stored MAX from Moses Lake is a milestone worth noting.